The auctioneer had already asked twice if anyone would give $15 for the condemned shed on Raven Creek Road. Walter Mercer could feel the cold coming up through the courthouse steps and into the soles of his boots. Elaine stood beside him in the gray wool coat she had owned since before either of them had imagined sleeping in their pickup. They had $18 left between them. When she lifted her hand, she did it only halfway. 18, she said. The county clerk stopped with his clipboard in midair. A few people turned around. Conrad Vale, the local property broker who had come to watch the lot fail, looked back and smiled. $18, he repeated, loud enough for the people near him to hear. Then he added, anybody want to save the Mercers from themselves? The laugh that followed was small, but Walter knew that kind of laugh. It was the sound people made after they had decided your fall was permanent. He did not look at Vale. He put one hand between Elaine's shoulder blades and held it there. The clerk called the bid once, then twice. Then he brought the clipboard against his thigh. Sold. A half hour later, Elaine slid a 10, a 5, and 3 worn $1 bills across the counter. The clerk gave her a brass key, a liability form, and a yellow copy warning that the structure was unsafe for occupancy. He hesitated before handing her the papers. You two have somewhere to stay? Elaine folded the receipt once. We do now. Walter and Elaine had not spent their lives being careless with money. Walter had worked 30 years at Harrow Creek Timber, most of them as a floor foreman. He could hear a saw blade drifting out of alignment before the gauges caught it. The first lesson he taught new men was simple. Stop talking long enough to hear what the machine is trying to tell you. Elaine had spent 28 years at the Ashford County Library. She could remember which children needed easier books, which patrons needed large print, and which families were quietly stretching one paycheck across too much month. She noticed more than she said. That habit had kept other people's dignity intact for decades. They bought a small house on Willow Branch Road in the late 80s. They paid it off after years of ordinary discipline, skipped vacations, second-hand appliances, and repairs Walter did himself. When Harrow Creek Timber shut down, Walter took maintenance work wherever he could find it. The jobs were smaller, but the house was theirs. Their savings were modest, but they were real. For a while, Walter believed they had finally reached the part of life where the ground stopped moving. Then their son called from Lexington. Grant Mercer had practiced real estate law for more than a decade. He was not stupid, and that was part of what made what happened harder to accept. He knew contracts. He knew leverage. He knew the difference between a risk and a warning. In 2019, he joined a residential development deal with 2 colleagues on the edge of Fayette County. 42 townhomes were supposed to sell quickly enough to cover an expensive bridge loan. They did not. 2 early buyers walked away. Construction costs rose. The lender started asking questions Grant could not answer without admitting the project was in trouble. One Tuesday night, he sat in his office with a spreadsheet open and convinced himself he needed only a temporary solution. The next morning, he called his parents. He told them a durable financial power of attorney was sensible estate planning. He said it would let him help if one of them became ill or could not handle their affairs. Walter read the papers twice. What can you actually do with this? He asked. Grant answered in words that were technically responsive and emotionally incomplete. It lets me step in if you need me, that's all. Walter still did not like it. Elaine looked at their son across the kitchen table. He's trying to make things easier for us. Walter sighed. Grant later told himself he never intended to steal from them. That was the story he built so he could keep moving. He used the authority they had given him to take control of $38,000 in savings. He moved statements away from Willow Branch Road so his parents would not see the changes immediately. He tied their money to the troubled development and told himself he would restore everything before they ever knew. He still called on Sundays. He still asked about Walter's knee. He still sent pictures of his daughter Sadie at school events and soccer games. He still sounded like their son. The development kept failing anyway. By the time the lender began formal collection, there was no clean way to separate Grant's gamble from the financial damage he had dragged into his parents' lives. The savings vanished first. Then came demands, fees, and paperwork Walter and Elaine had never agreed to in any meaningful sense. By the time it ended, the house on Willow Branch Road was gone too. The man who brought the final notice wore a blue button-down shirt and carried a folder under one arm. He explained what would happen next with the careful neutrality of someone who did this for a living. When he left, Walter closed the front door and stood in the kitchen. Elaine had painted pale green the first summer they owned the place. Grant answered on the 3rd ring. Walter told him what had arrived. There was a silence on the other end that was not confusion. It was recognition. "I was going to put it back," Grant said. Walter waited. Grant added, "I just needed more time." He did not begin with an apology. He did not ask what his parents needed. He offered the defense he had been repeating to himself for months. Walter held the phone until the screen went dark. For a while, he and Elaine stayed with people they knew. Then pride, discomfort, and the awkward arithmetic of other people's spare rooms pushed them back into their pickup. They learned which parking lots were quiet after midnight. They learned how cold a truck cab could become before dawn. They learned how quickly people begin speaking to you differently once your address disappears. On the morning of the county auction, $18 was what remained in Elaine's purse. They spent every dollar of it on a condemned shed no one else wanted. Raven Creek Road left Cedar Gap behind and narrowed after an old bridge over the creek. The pavement ended without ceremony. The road became packed dirt, then climbed toward a line of bare hardwoods. The shed stood at the end of a rutted track behind a wire fence that sagged between cedar posts. From the road, it looked exactly like the sort of structure a county would sell for almost nothing. Weathered boards had faded to gray. Rust feathered the edges of the metal roof. A chain had been looped through two eye bolts on the door. Walter parked the pickup and shut off the engine. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Elaine looked through the windshield. $18. Walter nodded. "Hour." She looked at him. He added, "Whatever else happens, they can't take this because of something we don't know about." He said it like a fact he had inspected and trusted. The padlock resisted his bolt cutters once. On the second try, it snapped. Walter unwound the chain and let it fall into the weeds. The swollen door needed both his shoulder and his patience. When it finally broke loose, it swung inward into darkness. The first thing Walter heard was ticking. Not one clock. Dozens of small mechanical beats layered together in the dark. The sound reached him before the room did. Elaine's hand closed around his forearm. Old wood, machine oil, and dry metal filled the air. Walter waited until his eyes adjusted. Then the flashlight beam found the shelves. Clocks covered the left wall from floor to ceiling. More sat along a long workbench. Others hung from brackets on the opposite wall. There were mantel clocks, alarm clocks with twin bells, a schoolhouse regulator, travel clocks, carriage clocks, and a brass marine clock gone green at the edges. Most had stopped years ago. Their hands pointed to different dead hours. But some were running. Walter counted because counting was how his mind entered an unfamiliar machine room. 17 clocks were alive inside a shed that had supposedly been locked since its owner died 7 years earlier. Walter lifted the nearest running mantel clock from its shelf. A narrow strip of paper had been taped to the back. The handwriting was small and exact. It had the deliberate shape of English, written by someone who had learned it later in life. Parker family. Repaired, April 1972. Last wound. Walter read the note twice. Elaine leaned closer. Tuesday was 3 days ago. They both looked toward the open door. The former owner, Wilhelm Reinhardt, had been dead 7 years. Someone was still coming in. Someone was still winding the clocks. Walter set the mantel clock back exactly where he had found it. His flashlight moved along the shelves until it caught a much larger clock high on the far wall. Dark walnut framed a German movement behind glass. The carving was restrained, almost severe. Its pendulum did not move. Its hands were fixed at 11:47. There was no paper on the back. No date. No family name. No maintenance note. It was the only large clock in the room that seemed intentionally silent. Walter studied it for a moment. Then he moved the light on. He and Elaine had bought a building for $18. They were beginning to understand they had inherited someone's unfinished attention. Helen Markham's pharmacy had occupied the same corner in Cedar Gap since her grandfather opened it before World War II. The oak cabinets behind the counter were original. Her father had refinished them once and refused to replace them. "Good wood only needs care," he used to say. Helen had repeated that sentence so often it no longer sounded like a quotation. A chain pharmacy had opened 2 blocks away the year before. Helen did not complain about it. She had spent 40 years learning that attention was more useful than complaint. People told Helen things while they waited for prescriptions. They told her who was sick, who was behind on rent, who was fighting with a daughter, and who had quietly stopped driving after dark. She never made a show of remembering. That was why people kept talking. Walter came in on Friday morning and laid the paper from the Parker clock on the counter. Helen put on her reading glasses. She read the 4 lines. Then she read them again. "Where did you get this?" "The Reinhardt shed on Raven Creek Road." Helen looked up. "You bought that place?" "For $18. She came around the counter and sat on the stool she normally kept for older patients. "You'd better sit too." Wilhelm Reinhardt had arrived in eastern Kentucky from Germany in 1956. He was 24, carried one suitcase, and owned a wooden case of clockmaker's tools that mattered more to him than anything else he brought. For his first year in Cedar Gap, he rented a room above Helen's grandfather's pharmacy. His English was careful, formal, and almost completely free of contractions. He had learned most of it from books. He opened a repair shop in a narrow storefront 2 streets away. Within a few years, mill workers, teachers, and business owners were all bringing him broken watches and clocks. He could rebuild movements other repairmen had already dismissed. He charged working families what the job actually cost him. The wealthier customers were charged the same rates and seemed oddly offended by the equality of it. Most of them paid anyway. The town needed Reinhardt long before it decided whether it liked him. He repaired the courthouse lobby clock when no one else could keep it running. He rebuilt the mechanism that drove the bell at Cedar Gap Baptist. The church board thanked him warmly and never quite found a place for him inside the social circle that met after services. He was useful. He was respected in the narrow way usefulness can create respect. But for many years, very few people bothered to know him. Eventually, he bought a small house and workshop on Raven Creek Road. That was where he stayed for the rest of his life. Helen turned the paper over in her hand. He kept records on every repair. Family name, date, part, whatever mattered. Walter pointed to the last line. "Someone wound this on Tuesday." Helen nodded before he finished. "Noah Brigg." Walter waited. "Noah's 19 now. Wilhelm took him on as a teenager during the last few years of his life. And he's still going out there?" Every Tuesday, Wilhelm made him promise not to let the running clocks stop. Elaine had come in behind Walter and was standing near the greeting card rack. "Did Noah know why?" "Not according to what he told me." Wilhelm said it mattered, and the boy believed him. Walter thought of the 17 moving second hands in the dark shed. Then he remembered the large German clock. "There's one on the far wall, walnut case, German movement, stopped at 11:47. Helen's face changed. The change was slight, but Walter had spent his life watching small changes before larger failures. "That one was his," she said. "Do you know why he left it stopped?" Helen folded her hands in her lap. "He once told my father there are things you should not force to continue after the person who gave them meaning is gone." Walter looked at her. "That's all. That's all he ever said here." Helen gave the paper back to him. "Whatever you found in that shed, don't treat it like abandoned junk. Wilhelm never kept anything accidentally." The next morning, Walter and Elaine returned with a notebook, 2 flashlights, and a folding chair. Walter began at the left end of the first shelf. He worked the way he had worked a saw line, top to bottom, left to right. No skipped section because it looked unimportant. Elaine sat with the notebook on her knee. Walter lifted each running clock, read the label, and called out the family name: Parker, Mullen, Kate, Riley, Dalton, Hensley. The names belonged to the county's old working families. They were names on rural mailboxes, union memorials, church directories, and school yearbooks. They were not the names Walter associated with the bank board, the nicest houses in town, or the people who had quietly controlled county business for generations. Wilhelm Reinhardt had repaired clocks for everyone, but he had kept these. By the 10th clock, Elaine had noticed the pattern too. These are families who would have had trouble replacing what they brought him. Walter turned over a pressed oak shelf clock. The note read that the owner had died before collecting it. Wilhelm had added one line beneath the repair date: keeping for family. Elaine wrote those words down. They appeared again on another clock. Then they reached a brass carriage clock. Dalton family. Repaired June 1970. Last wound. The next was a cheap oak clock manufactured during the 40s. Working families across Appalachia had owned thousands like it, but this one bore the name Norris. Walter replaced it on the shelf. One running clock remained. He could hear it at the far end, deeper in the shadow. Elaine looked down at her notebook. 16 family. Walter moved the flashlight. There should be 17. Elaine gave a dry little smile. Maybe ours never gave him anything worth remembering. It was not self-pity. It was the way a librarian states what the current evidence suggests. Walter reached into the back corner of the shelf. His hand closed around a small walnut mantel clock no larger than a cigar box. Its case had darkened almost to black. The paper on the back was brittle and brown at the edges. The handwriting was Reinhardt's. Mercer family. Thomas Mercer. Repaired and kept, September 1975. Below that, pressed harder into the paper, were 2 final words: still running. Walter stopped breathing for a moment. Elaine stood up. Thomas was your father. Walter nodded. The memory arrived as something he had heard only once. His father had owned a small walnut clock that sat on the mantel in Walter's childhood home. Every Sunday morning before church, Thomas Mercer wound it. In the fall of 1975, Walter's mother became sick enough that medicines started costing more than the family could comfortably manage. Thomas sold the clock to the German repairman in Cedar Gap. He sold it because Reinhardt paid fairly and did not ask a poor man to explain a private emergency. Thomas never bought it back. Walter had assumed the clock was sold again or discarded decades ago. Instead, it was ticking in his hands. Reinhardt had repaired it. He had kept it. Someone had wounded it every week after his death because Reinhardt had asked them to. Walter calculated the years without meaning to. Almost half a century. Elaine came beside him and placed one hand on his sleeve. Neither of them said anything for a while. The clock did not need them to. Its heavier beat filled the small space between Walter's palms. While Walter continued cataloging the shelves, Elaine moved to the workbench. She approached it the way she used to approach a new archive donation. Context before conclusion. The bench surface had been worn smooth by decades of hands. Tools hung from a pegboard above it, each one fitted into a pencil outline. Small cardboard boxes sat below in alphabetical order. Balance staff, barrels, click spring, crown wheels. 2 rows of books stood at the right end of the bench. German clockmaking manuals were paired with English references beside them. The arrangement looked like a bridge Wilhelm had built for himself over many years. Behind the manuals, Elaine found a black cloth ledger lying flat. The spine was cracked. The corners had gone soft from use. She opened it expecting repair accounts. There were no columns for charges or payments. Instead, there were names, dates, parcels, and stories. The first entry she read concerned a miner named Harold Pruitt. Pruitt had come in with a pocket watch in the spring of 1972. While Reinhardt worked, Pruitt talked about 8 acres his family owned above a ridge outside Cedar Gap. A representative from Crown Ridge Resources had offered him a few $100s for rights connected to the property. Pruitt had not understood one clause in the agreement. The representative told him it was standard language and moved past it. 3 pages later, Elaine found a widow named May Harlan. She had signed a similar document in her husband's hospital room after a stroke. Her reading glasses were at home. The company man already had the pen uncapped. She asked whether she could take the papers with her. He told her delay would complicate the deal, and that everyone else on the road was signing, so she signed too. Elaine kept reading. The names changed. The pattern did not. Families transferred mineral rights through agreements they did not fully understand. Company representatives answered questions quickly and steered people away from the sections that mattered most. Reinhardt did not accuse anyone in the margins. He simply recorded what people told him, the date they told him, and the details they could remember. Elaine closed the book and called Walter over. He read the Pruitt entry. Then he read May Harlan's. He wasn't just writing things down. Elaine rested her hand on the ledger. He was building an archive for people no archive was keeping. Walter looked over her shoulder at the wall behind the bench. One section of lower paneling had a steel latch that did not match the rest of the shed. He crouched and lifted it. The panel swung outward on a piano hinge. Behind it was a metal document box bolted between the studs. A combination lock still hung from the clasp. Walter cut it. Inside were 23 manila envelopes, numbered in the upper right corner. Behind them sat a plastic cassette case holding 12 tapes. The labels showed dates from the early 80s through the end of that decade. Elaine looked back toward the workbench. A portable Sony recorder sat on the shelf beside the technical manuals. She had noticed it earlier and left it alone. Now she took it down. The battery compartment was intact. Walter chose the first tape. Elaine found replacement batteries in the pickup. The recorder clicked when she pressed play. A man's voice came through the small speaker. Walter had never heard Wilhelm Reinhardt speak. Still, he knew immediately who it was. The English was formal and measured. Every consonant seemed placed rather than tossed into the sentence. Reinhardt read family names, parcel numbers, dates, and summaries from the ledger. He identified Crown Ridge Resources once and then referred to it simply as the company. He offered almost no opinion. The lack of opinion made the details feel heavier. Tape 1 lasted a little over 40 minutes. At the end, Reinhardt said he would continue the record on tape 2. They listened to the second tape without speaking. Elaine followed along in the ledger and marked 2 pages she wanted to revisit. Tape 3 began differently. There was restaurant noise in the background, cups touching saucers. A chair scraping. Someone calling an order from farther away. Then Reinhardt's voice came close to the recorder. A second man answered him. The second voice was younger and smoother. It had the practiced confidence of someone used to being believed in business conversations. He was trying to buy land from Reinhardt. Wilhelm owned a small ridge parcel east of Cedar Gap. The younger man called it difficult ground with limited residential value. He said Crown Ridge was assembling nearby parcels for conservation and future land management. Reinhardt asked what fair market value meant in numbers. The man gave him an offer. Then Reinhardt asked whether a mineral survey had already been performed. The pause on the tape lasted only a couple of seconds. It was long enough. The representative said standard due diligence had been completed. Reinhardt asked again whether the company knew what lay beneath the parcel. The representative answered that the survey results were consistent with the geology of the ridge. Wilhelm said he would consider the offer. The conversation drifted to ordinary matters for several minutes and ended. Walter stopped the recorder. Elaine had already opened envelope 7. She placed a geological assessment on the bench. The report had been completed weeks before several local families signed away mineral rights. It identified a coal seam beneath the ridge and estimated its continuation across multiple parcels. Clipped to the report was a handwritten note. Thomas Mercer said he did not understand what mineral rights meant. No one explained it to him. Walter read the note once, then again. It was his father's name in the same careful hand that had labeled the clock. Reinhardt had preserved the family's timepiece. He had also preserved the sentence Thomas Mercer did not know anyone would ever need. Grant arrived that afternoon in a gray sedan clean enough to look out of place on Raven Creek Road. Walter heard the engine before he saw the car. Grant parked outside the sagging fence and got out in a dark sport coat with an open-collar shirt. He looked at the shed, then at his father's pickup, then at the light in the single window. Walter came to the doorway. "Dad." Grant stayed on the other side of the fence. "I heard you and Mom bought this place." Walter waited. "I wanted to make sure you're both okay out here." Grant had Elaine's eyes in Walter's hands. At that moment, Walter trusted neither the eyes nor the hands. "Is there something you came to say?" Grant looked past him toward the shed interior. "No, I just wanted to check on you." "We're fine." Grant nodded as if an appointment had ended. He returned to the sedan and turned carefully on the narrow track. Before reaching the road, he looked back once at the shed. The glance was quick. Walter knew the difference between concern and calculation. 5 days later arrived from a law office in a nearby town. It claimed there were questions about the ownership and provenance of certain items inside the property Walter and Elaine had purchased at auction. The letter asked them not to remove, alter, or dispose of anything until those questions were resolved. Elaine read it twice at the folding table they had set up inside the shed. Then she turned the envelope over. "The return address is in the Hartwell building." Walter looked at her. "Grant's firm uses a satellite office there." "Same firm?"
No.
"Same building." She tapped the letterhead. "I remember the address from the power of attorney paperwork." Walter did not ask how she'd be sure. 28 years in a library had made forgetting exact addresses almost unnatural for her. That evening, Helen Markham called. A man had come into the pharmacy asking what the Mercers had found on Raven Creek Road. He wanted to know how long they had been in the shed and whether they had shown its contents to anyone. Helen told him she did not know what he meant. Then she suggested he ask the county assessor. "Who was it?" Walter asked. "He didn't give a name." Helen paused. "But Conrad Vale has spent 30 years knowing things before the rest of Cedar Gap knows them." Walter said nothing. If Grant called somebody local, Helen continued, Vale would be a likely person to call. Walter thanked her and hung up. He took the pickup keys from the hook. Elaine came from the back corner with her coat already on. Neither of them had to explain the next step. They moved the ledger, tapes, and recorder out of the shed that night. Walter handled each box with both hands. The documents did not belong to him simply because the county had sold him the building around them. They belonged in some unfinished way to the people named inside. He set the carton against the pickup cab and braced it with his toolbox so it would not slide. When the tailgate was latched, Elaine remained at the shed door. "I want one more look." Walter took the flashlight and followed her inside. This time they were not inventorying anything. Elaine moved slowly along the shelves, looking rather than searching. She stopped at the schoolhouse regulator. She stopped beneath Reinhardt's silent German clock at 11:47. She ran one finger across the worn edge of the workbench. Then she noticed a small glass display case near the floor to the right of the bench. Walter had assumed it held spare parts. The case was about the size of a shoebox. Its blue velvet lining had faded almost gray. Inside sat a child's bedside clock with a white face and a brushed brass case. Its hands were moving. Elaine crouched. Then she stood so quickly Walter thought she had hurt her knee. Her face had gone still. "What is it?" She did not answer. Walter opened the case. He lifted the clock and turned it over. There was no paper taped to the back. Instead, words had been engraved directly into the brass. Mercer Andrew, given to Reinhardt, November 1988. Repaired and kept. Walter read the words silently. Then he read them aloud. Elaine brought one hand to her mouth. Andrew Mercer had been 4 years old when he died in January 1989. Bacterial meningitis moved through him faster than either parent could understand what was happening. He was feverish early in the week. By Sunday he was gone. Afterward, Walter and Elaine packed away the small objects that were hardest to see. Not everything. Only the things that still seemed to expect a 4-year-old boy to return. The bedside clock had stood beside Andrew's bed. He liked its sound. At night, he would ask them to leave it ticking, because the rhythm helped him sleep. After the funeral, neither Walter nor Elaine could bear that sound in the house. Walter had forgotten exactly when the clock disappeared. He had assumed it was donated or sold with other things during those first numb months. But the engraving said November 1988, 2 months before Andrew died. Someone had taken the clock to Reinhardt while Andrew was still alive. Not so given. Reinhardt repaired it. Then after the boy died, he kept it. For more than 3 decades, he or the apprentice he trained had kept it running. Elaine lowered her hand from her mouth. How did he know? Walter looked at the word cut into brass. Kept, not stored, not repaired and forgotten. Kept. Somebody told him enough, Walter said. Elaine stared at the moving hands. Or he understood what they couldn't say. The small clock ticked between them. It sounded exactly like the clock Andrew had once wanted beside him in the dark. Walter had spent much of his life listening for the sound that meant something was about to fail. Wilhelm Reinhardt had spent his listening for the things people were trying not to lose. Helen made one phone call the next morning. Rebecca Wynne had grown up in Ashford County and left for law school in Lexington. She returned after graduation and built a practice above a hardware store in Cedar Gap. For nearly 30 years, she had handled estates, land disputes, small business fights, and the kind of cases that required knowing both the law and the people who would have to live beside each other afterward. Helen told her about the shed. Rebecca listened. Then Helen said, "Start with envelope 4. Walter and Elaine carried the carton to Rebecca's office on Tuesday morning. Rebecca began with the ledger. She read 3 entries without comment. Then she opened envelope 4. Inside was an old mineral rights agreement, a geological report, and Reinhardt's note about a man named Amos Swinn. The note said Amos did not understand what he had signed in the spring of 1974, because no one had explained it in terms he could follow. Rebecca set the paper down. Amos Wynne had been her maternal grandfather. He died when she was 11. She inserted tape 3 into the recorder. Walter watched the second hand on the wall clock while the tape played. When the conversation ended, Rebecca remained silent for nearly 2 minutes. Then she folded her hands over the closed ledger. "I need a week." Elaine looked at her. "For what?" "To find out whether this is history or a current problem." Rebecca looked at Walter. "And until I know, don't tell anyone what you have." She explained what she could already see. Hartwell Mining LLC had operated an extraction site in eastern Ashford County for more than a decade. Much of its mineral estate traced back to agreements Crown Ridge Resources collected from local families in the 70s and 80s. Crown Ridge no longer existed. Hartwell had acquired major parts of its assets years before the old company dissolved. The documents in Reinhardt's box suggested Crown Ridge knew more about subsurface value than it disclosed while negotiating with individual landowners. The current operation might therefore depend on rights whose chain of title could be challenged. Walter looked at the geological report. So something done 40 years ago can still matter now. If Hartwell is still relying on those rights today, then yes, the present use can still matter. Rebecca tapped the recorder. "This is what makes me pay attention." She explained that Reinhardt was a participant in the conversation on tape 3. That fact mattered to the legality of making the recording and to the argument over whether it could be used. More important, the company representative had acknowledged that a survey existed before at least some purchase offers were made. "That is not the whole case," Rebecca said. "But it is something a defense lawyer cannot wave away as family memory." She looked at the carton again. "Give me 1 week. Grant called Walter the next day. His voice was polite. He called again Friday. This time the politeness sounded strained. Saturday evening he called and hung up without leaving a message. Walter did not call back. On Thursday night, Grant drove out to Raven Creek Road. Sadie got out of the passenger side wearing a red jacket and carrying a small backpack. At 10 years old, she had already learned that adults sometimes gave long explanations when short truths would do. She looked from the shed to the pickup to her grandfather. Then Elaine came through the door. Sadie ran to her. Elaine wrapped both arms around the girl. Grant stayed near the fence. For a few seconds, he watched his daughter with his mother. Then he looked at Walter. "Dad, we need to talk about what you found before this gets bigger than you understand." Walter waited. "There are ownership questions," Grant continued. "There are people with legal interests in whatever was left here. If you've handed things over without knowing the full picture," Sadie, Walter said. The girl turned. "Go inside with Grandma, she'll show you the clocks." Sadie looked once at her father. Then she took Elaine's hand. Through the shed window, Walter could see Elaine pointing out the running clocks one by one. Grant watched too. When he spoke again, the lawyer's voice was gone. "She's been asking why she doesn't see you." Walter looked at him. "I know. She thinks I did something." "You did." Grant's mouth tightened. Walter did not raise his voice. "Go home, Grant." Grant stood there another second. Then he walked back to the car. Walter watched him leave without feeling victorious. There was nothing victorious about telling your son to go home. Rebecca used the week exactly as promised. She matched names in Reinhardt's ledger to county land records. She traced old agreements forward through later corporate transfers. She contacted living descendants one family at a time. She did not tell them they had won anything. She told them there were records they needed to see. 17 families had living representatives willing to be named in the first filing. Others needed time. Some were skeptical. A few had spent so many years hearing that old deals were untouchable that hope itself sounded suspicious. Walter understood that reaction better than he wanted to. The first hearing took place in the Ashford County Courthouse on a Thursday afternoon. It was the same stone building where Elaine had spent their last $18 months earlier. Conrad Vale sat in the third row of the gallery beside a man Walter did not recognize. Vale did not smile this time. Rebecca placed the black ledger, the numbered envelopes, and the cassette recorder on counsel table. She did not play an hour of tape. She played less than a minute. The company representative's voice confirmed that Crown Ridge had completed subsurface due diligence before the proposed purchase of Reinhardt's land. Then Rebecca stopped the recording. The judge looked at the recorder, then at the geological reports, then at the ledger with its cracked cloth spine. Mr. Reinhardt maintained these records for more than 30 years. Elaine sat behind Rebecca with the ledger on her lap. 31, she said. The judge glanced toward her. Elaine added, "The first entry in that volume is April 1983. There was no challenge in her voice. Only accuracy. The judge nodded. 31 years. Vale lowered his eyes. Walter almost smiled but did not. Accuracy had always been Elaine's preferred form of resistance. The hearing did not produce a dramatic ruling that afternoon. Real legal disputes rarely moved at the speed people imagined from television. The court set the next procedural steps. Counsel argued about records, notice, and what evidence could be developed. The families went home with no checks and no final answers. 6 days later, Hartwell Mining's attorneys contacted Rebecca. The call was framed as preliminary. Nothing said on it was an admission. 3 weeks later, Hartwell agreed to mediation with the 17 represented families. The company denied wrongdoing. It also agreed to pause extraction on the contested parcels while the dispute was being addressed. Rebecca explained the significance without celebrating it. "Their lawyers have seen enough risk to stop digging while we talk." That was all she would say. The county did not suddenly become fair because one old box had been opened, but something had shifted. For decades, the families had been the people expected to prove they understood contracts written by companies with lawyers. Now a company had to answer records preserved by a clockmaker who had listened when those families said they did not understand. Conrad Vale's name never appeared in the filings. No document connected him directly to the mineral rights transactions Reinhardt had recorded. His influence had always been more local and less formal than that. He knew who to call. He knew who was worried. He knew which conversations were useful before they became public. After the hearing, Vale was still in Cedar Gap. He still sold property. He still attended board meetings. He simply stopped taking his usual route past the courthouse at lunchtime. Grant's situation moved on a separate track. Walter and Elaine did not need Reinhardt's records to understand what their son had done. Their account histories and the power of attorney documents told that story. The Kentucky Bar Association opened a disciplinary inquiry into Grant's conduct. The prosecutor's office, with jurisdiction over his financial activity, also began reviewing whether his use of the authority crossed criminal lines. The allegation was straightforward, even if the legal process was not. Grant had used a power his parents gave him for their protection to move $38,000 without their informed consent and expose their financial life to his private business risk. Grant hired his own attorney. Nothing was resolved quickly. Walter had spent enough years around industrial equipment to know that some processes sound slow, only because the force is building where you cannot see it. On the Tuesday after the hearing, Noah Briggs arrived at the shed carrying a small leather tool roll. Walter was standing on a step stool winding one of the higher clocks. Noah nodded as if finding the new owner there was the most ordinary thing in the world. Morning, morning. Noah moved through the room without asking where anything was. He knew which peg held the oil bottle. He knew which floorboard lifted slightly near the bench. He knew which bracket clock ran fast after damp weather. Walter watched him remove a small movement from its case. "Can I ask you something?" Noah looked up. "Sure. Why do you still come?" Noah waited. Walter gestured toward the shelves. "Reinhardt's been gone 7 years. You don't owe him rent. You don't own the clocks. Nobody's paying you." Noah set down his screwdriver. For a moment, he seemed to consider whether the question was more complicated than Walter had made it. Near the end, he sat me right there. Noah pointed to the chair beside the workbench. He told me, "Do not let the running ones stop." Walter listened. I asked which ones. He said I would know because they were already running. Did he tell you why? No. Noah picked up the screwdriver again. He asked me, so I did it. There was no sentiment in his answer. That made Walter believe it more. When Walter trained young workers at Harrow Creek Timber, the best of them eventually understood that discipline did not need a speech every morning. You did the thing correctly because it had been placed in your care. Noah stayed an hour. Before leaving, he wound 2 clocks Walter had trouble reaching and showed him where Reinhardt kept spare suspension springs. He did not ask about the lawsuit. He did not ask about the tapes. He came because a dead man had trusted him with 17 small promises. On an early Wednesday in October, Grant returned. The maples along Raven Creek had only begun to turn. Their upper leaves carried thin edges of red while the lower branches stayed green. Grant parked outside the fence. This time he brought no folder. No phone was in his hand. He stood beside the car until Walter finished his coffee inside the shed. Then Walter went out. They faced each other across the fence. Grant looked older than he had in March. Not dramatically older, just less protected by the version of himself he used in offices. "I don't know what to say, Dad." Walter nodded once. "I know." Grant looked down at the dirt track. "I'm sorry." Walter's first impulse was to search the sentence for everything missing from it. An explanation, a plan, a promise, a defense. There was nothing else. He looked past Grant toward the trees. For months, Walter had imagined an apology as if receiving one would create a clear next step. It did not. "I hear you," he said. Grant looked up. Walter kept his eyes on the maples. "I don't know what to do with it yet." He let the silence sit where it belonged. "I need time." Grant nodded. It was a smaller movement than Walter expected. He did not ask how much time. He got back into the sedan, turned around, and drove away. Walter stayed at the fence until he could no longer hear the engine. Then he returned to the shed. 17 clocks kept ticking. None of them demanded that a damaged thing be called repaired before it was. The connection to Wilhelm Reinhardt's family began with a church secretary. Elaine remembered that a small Lutheran congregation in Cedar Gap had donated German-language books to the county library years earlier. She still knew the secretary's name. One phone call led to another. A retired miner knew a family with relatives near the Black Forest region of Germany. That family knew someone who recognized the Reinhardt surname. 10 days later, Elaine received an email from a woman named Erika Reinhardt. She was 71 and wrote in careful English that Wilhelm had been her uncle. She had wondered for years what happened to his workshop after he died. They arranged a video call for Saturday afternoon. Sadie was spending the weekend with Walter and Elaine. Grant dropped her at the end of the track and did not come to the shed door. No one had formally created that arrangement. It had simply become the shape everyone could manage for the moment. Sadie climbed into the chair beside Walter at the small table with the laptop. Erika appeared on the screen from a kitchen in Germany. She had short white hair and reading glasses pushed onto the top of her head. A younger woman sat just outside the camera frame and occasionally helped her find an English word. The connection lagged by half a second. Twice, Sadie leaned toward the screen and said, "Could you say that again?" Adults might have worried the request sounded rude. Erica seemed relieved by the clarity. She repeated herself more slowly. She had last seen Wilhelm in 1961. He had returned to Germany for one visit several years after leaving for Kentucky. He spoke about Cedar Gap as a place he had chosen before he was completely certain the place had chosen him. He also spoke about a woman named Elsa. Walter glanced toward Elaine. Erica explained. Elsa and Wilhelm had planned to marry before he emigrated. The plan was for Wilhelm to establish a shop and home in America, then bring her over once he was settled. Settling took longer than he expected. They wrote letters instead. In the fall of 1962, Elsa became seriously ill. Wilhelm booked passage back across the Atlantic because he intended to bring her to the United States as soon as she could travel. She died while he was still on the ship. When Wilhelm arrived in New York, a telegram was waiting. He never returned to Germany after that. My mother said he wrote less after Elsa died, Erica said. The younger woman murmured a word from off-screen. Erica nodded. But he always wrote that he was busy. He said people in Kentucky needed someone who would pay attention. Her eyes moved slightly away from the camera. I think paying attention to other people was how he survived not being able to help her. Walter looked through the shed window at the large German clock on the far wall. The hands still read 11:47. Erica, there is a clock here that belonged to him, walnut case. German movement. She listened. It stopped in 1962. The hands are at 11:47. Erica's face became very still. Yes, Walter waited. That was the time Elsa died in Germany, 11:47. Sadie turned toward the wall clock. Erica continued. My mother said Wilhelm wanted one clock in his American home to run on Elsa's time. She took off her glasses. Then she died. The screen froze for a fraction of a second and returned, so he stopped it. Sadie had been quiet longer than usual. He wanted it to keep time with her while she was alive. Erica looked toward the camera. Yes, Sadie looked back at the silent clock, and when she was gone, he didn't want it pretending. No one corrected her. That night, Walter sat alone in the shed with Reinhardt's technical notebook open on his knee. Among repair diagrams and movement specifications were several pages of instructions for the German wall clock. Wilhelm had written the original notes in German on the left. On the right, he had translated every step into English. The translation was exact enough for another person to follow decades later. Walter read the instructions once. Then he closed the notebook. He looked at the clock for a long time. He did not touch it. The next morning, Sadie was in the yard collecting red leaves when Walter called her inside. Want to learn how to wind a clock? She looked immediately at the German clock. That one? Walter shook his head. We start small. Sadie considered that. Because I could break it? Because some things should wait until you know what your hands are doing. She accepted the answer. The mornings after that developed a rhythm. Sadie sat at the workbench beside Walter with a shallow parts tray between them. He taught her how to remove a movement without forcing the case. He showed her how to feel resistance before it became damage. He showed her that winding a clock was not about turning a key as far as it would go. It was about knowing when enough was enough. Sadie learned quickly because she wanted to. She also learned carefully, which mattered more to Walter. Across the room, Elaine worked with Rebecca to identify descendants of families named in Reinhardt's ledger. The laptop sat open beside the black cloth book. One by one, they found people who had no idea that a German clockmaker had written down something their grandfather, aunt, or mother said 40 years earlier. Noah continued coming on Tuesdays. At first, he and Walter worked around each other. Then they began working together. Walter knew industrial machinery. Noah knew clock. Each man understood enough about the other's skill to avoid pretending they were the same thing. Grant began coming on Saturdays. He parked outside the fence. Then, after a few weeks, he started coming through the gate. He usually sat in the old wooden chair just inside the shed door. The chair was close enough that he could watch Sadie work. It was far enough from the bench that he was not included automatically. He did not offer advice. He did not tell Walter what the disciplinary process was doing. He did not ask Elaine to forgive him. Sometimes he brought 2 cups of coffee. He set one near Walter and kept the other in both hands. Walter never thanked him for the coffee. He also never told him to stop bringing it. That was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was simply the amount of access Walter could tolerate without lying to himself. One afternoon near the end of October, Sadie set down a screwdriver and looked up at the German wall clock. Grandpa, Walter followed her eyes. Are we ever going to wind that one? The walnut case had darkened with age. The pendulum remained still. The hands held 11:47, the minute a woman died thousands of miles away while the man who loved her was crossing an ocean too late. Walter looked at Grant near the door. His son was watching Sadie, not the clock. Elaine's pen moved across a legal pad. Noah was not there that day, but the running family clocks and Andrew's small bedside clock kept their separate beats. Walter turned back to Sadie. Someday. She waited. Just not today. Sadie nodded. She picked up the screwdriver and returned to the small movement in front of her. Her hands stayed steady. Grant shifted once in the wooden chair and said nothing. Elaine kept writing. The shed held the sound of clocks that had been kept running because someone once decided they mattered. The silent German clock remained stopped because someone had once decided that mattered too. Walter understood now that keeping faith with something did not always mean restoring it to motion. Sometimes care meant maintaining what could still be carried forward. Sometimes it meant refusing to pretend a loss had not changed the measure of time. Grant's apology mattered because he finally stopped defending the intention and faced the consequence. But an apology did not return the house on Willow Branch Road. It did not replace the savings. It did not erase the months Walter and Elaine spent wondering how their own son had used their trust as collateral. Forgiveness, if it came, would not be the same thing as giving him the same access he once had. The distinction mattered because families often confuse love with permission. Wilhelm Reinhardt had understood another distinction just as clearly. He could not repair the contracts people had already signed, and he could not reverse the losses they carried into his shop. So he did what was within his power. He listened. He wrote things down. He preserved what people could not afford to lose. He trained someone younger to continue the work without requiring that young man to understand every reason first. None of those acts looked dramatic when they happened. A clock wound on a Tuesday is a very small thing. A note in a ledger is a very small thing. A question asked carefully while someone waits for a repair is a very small thing. Over enough years, small acts of attention can become evidence, memory, inheritance, and shelter. Walter and Elaine had spent $18 because they had almost nothing left. What they found did not magically restore the life they had before Grant's decision. It gave them something different, a place to stand, a record that other families could use, a connection to a son they had lost decades earlier, and a clearer understanding of what had to be earned before trust could be called trust again. The most useful promise in the shed was not that every broken thing would run as if nothing happened. It was that what still mattered would be handled carefully enough not to be lost a second time.